Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we are talking with an artist that has made the world her studio. Celt Duk recently completed an epic 4.5-month solo bike ride from her home in Montreal to the Beaufort Sea in the Canadian Arctic. Hi, Celt. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
I'm super keen to learn more about this trip, but before we start talking about this trip, can you maybe talk a little bit about yourself and how you got into cycling?
Well, basically, I've always had this very strong connection to nature. I spent most of my childhood growing up in the suburbs of Montreal, but I did have a cottage in the Adirondacks, so I always loved to play in the woods, swim in the lake, and go hiking. And there's always been this longing to just go and do a journey. And I used to dream a lot about going to explore different places, and so that stayed with me my whole life. And growing up, I also used to hear the stories of my dad who biked across the country way back. And so that was something that was always on my mind. I would think, maybe this is something I want to do one day. And in my early 20s, I was at the point where I was starting to plan this big trip across Europe. And being that this was in 2019, those plans were out the window. COVID happened, everything shut down, and there was no trip to Europe that was going to happen. I feel that, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of us had a difficult time with the isolation and having to deal with restrictions. And I know that I went through a very tough time in the beginning, and when the restrictions started to lift, I started taking trips up north, and this whole desire to just go out and travel really started to get intense. And I didn't know how it was going to happen or where I was going to go. And then in July, I did my first little tour with a friend of mine. We rode from Montreal to Quebec City. And I thought, this is really a great way to travel. It's really a great way to experience things and see new places, meet new people. And 3 weeks later, I bought my gravel bike and I bought all the gear that I needed. And without any concrete plan of what my route was going to look like, I rode to the Saguenay and then I went to the Gaspésie Peninsula, and it was just such an awesome experience. And that trip lasted about 6 weeks, and I was hooked after that.
And one thing I think is really interesting is when you do your trips, you also are doing art along the way. And so this is not just, just riding your bike. You're also painting and how do you balance that while you're doing, these arduous bike trips?
It is really hard to paint on the road. You are very tired at the end of the day usually. And even though I don't get as much done as I would like to, what I try to do is on my days off, I try to squeeze in a couple hours to start something, and I do a lot of realism, so over the course of a few weeks on my days off, I'll be working on a piece, or sometimes I'll stop on the side of the road and do a quick sketch.
Can you describe the route you took from Montreal to the Arctic? What states did you go through, and then when you went through Canada, what parts did you explore?
So when I left Montreal, I started off by going through Ontario. And I was questioning whether I was going to go through Northern Ontario or through the States. And with going to the Arctic Ocean, you're on a time limit because the weather gets colder earlier in the season. So I figured that going through the States would be a faster option. And so I went through Michigan, I went through Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and re-entered Canada back through Saskatchewan. And that's when I started to kind of go northwest into the Rockies. And once I got to the Rockies, I went straight north all the way over to the Stewart-Cassiar Highway, made my way to the Alaska Highway, and just went all the way north from there.
And when you were, how much of your route had you planned beforehand? Did you have an idea when you set off where you were going to go, or was it kind of making it up as you went along?
I had a general idea of how the route would look, but I usually planned my route when I woke up in the morning. Especially further south, there's a lot more roads. So I would kind of decide which ones look cooler to go and explore. And so, yeah, early in the trip, it was kind of random and I would just decide on the spot. But the further north you get, you don't have a lot of route options. So it was either the Stewart-Cassiar Highway or the Alaska Highway the whole way up. I didn't have much of a choice. So,
And when you were planning the trip, were there certain areas or certain parts of the route that you were really excited for? Were there any that you were kind of dreading and thinking, oh, this isn't going to be great?
I guess that one of the places I was the most worried about were the prairies. I was told that going west through the prairies, there was going to be a lot of headwinds. So that was something that I worried about. And even though there were strong winds, it wasn't too bad in the end. But I was the most excited for the Yukon. That was really the part of the trip that I thought about the most over 4 years of planning.
And for someone that's thinking of doing this route, like what are some of the challenges that you thought you'd have to deal with? You mentioned, the winds going across the prairies. But also what were some of the challenges that you didn't expect that ended up, making this a difficult journey?
One of the biggest challenges I faced on this road, it was a bit of a series of events. I walked into the woods one night and the trail that I took to go into the woods was slightly overgrown, and I didn't realize as I was walking through this path with my bike that I was getting covered in hundreds of ticks. And that was definitely a big shock for me. And even after I got them all off of me and off of all my gear, for 4 days after, I was still finding them on me. They were falling out of my hair. I would find them in my tent. And as I was sharing my trip on social media, a few people reached out to me and suggested that I go get antibiotics to prevent Lyme disease, especially out east. It's more common to catch the disease from ticks. And being that I was covered in hundreds of them, I didn't want to risk that. So I got back to Canada as quick as I could, got to a doctor, and he prescribed me doxycycline. And what he didn't tell me about antibiotics, and what I didn't know, is that when you take them, you can't be out in the sun because your skin becomes so sensitive to it and you burn very badly. So for about a month after that, I had to cover head to toe. I was wearing gloves. I was wearing a mask over my face. Not a single bit of my skin was showing. And even then, I somehow was still getting burnt. So that was definitely a challenge as the weather was getting warmer.
That sounds horrible. Just not only the ticks sound horrible. I've had one tick on me. And I remember I came back from a hiking trip and I was in the shower and I just was like, saw myself in the mirror. I said, "What the hell is that black thing?" And I looked at it and I saw a tick on my back and that freaked me out. But hundreds of them and them falling out of your hair. And you're by yourself camping. That must have been really stressful.
Yeah, it was. And I had never traveled before midsummer in the past, so I never dealt with ticks. And this was just something I didn't even think of when I got on this trip. I didn't think I was going to see them or anything. Or I didn't think about them at all is what I meant to say.
Yeah, I don't think anyone thinks of having hundreds of ticks. I've heard of people having a couple, but that just sounds atrocious. And then what was the impact of your body on this trip? 4.5 months. And then the last bit, like going up the Rockies, in Alaska and the Yukon, there's lots of hills there as well. How did your body react to this? You've done obviously a big trip in the Gaspé region of Quebec, but was this different in terms of the toll on your body?
Yes, definitely. And what I actually forgot to mention is that around the time I was finishing the antibiotics, that's when I was getting to the Rockies. And I was dealing with a lot of fatigue at that point. And so that was also very difficult. And the Rockies, the hills out there are a lot bigger than the ones in Quebec. So it was challenging at first on my body. But as I got off the antibiotics and I could expose my skin again and, my health was kind of recovering, I was getting a lot stronger and the hills were getting much easier. However, getting to the Dempster Highway, was definitely the most challenging part of the whole trip because it's all gravel and very rough roads, and the hills are absolutely massive out there. I was definitely pushing my body to its limits.
And looking at your photos on social media, the part that really stood out to me was the area, I think it was on the Stuart Cassier Highway. Like it just looked spectacular. But after doing the whole trip, is that, was that the most spectacular? Or did you find there was other parts that were really kind of beautiful and special and resonated with you?
So even though British Columbia was absolutely stunning, I had people telling me as I was making my way to the Dempster that I was going to think that I had died and went to heaven. Someone told me that because the scenery up there is spectacular, and I knew I was going to see some really cool places. But when I got there, my mind was absolutely blown. I It was probably the most beautiful stretch of road on this entire trip. It was just really otherworldly.
And you did this trip solo, which, lots of people do it solo. Lots of people go with friends or groups. In your case, doing it solo, what are some of the challenges that created? And also, I guess, what are some of the benefits for you doing it solo?
Yeah, so it's funny because my first two trips that I took solo prior to this one, I had a harder time with it. I was definitely more nervous. I had to overcome challenges like camping alone in the woods and, just being alone all the time. It's a bit scary at first, but I felt that the first two trips really grew my confidence in being alone. And so when I started this journey, I felt very comfortable with the isolation. And even then, I was never entirely alone. I was always running into people. And so there was this balance of still having a connection to others, but also having time alone. And I really enjoyed being alone and having my own freedom to wake up when I wanted or just continue riding later into the day if I wanted to do that. And also just getting to plan my route and not have to really compromise with anyone else. Like I was just totally free and I really enjoyed that.
Can you talk a little bit about meeting other people on this trip? You're going through lots of small towns. What were the people like when you're riding?
Everyone was absolutely phenomenal. I had absolutely no issues on the road with others. I had no scary issues with anyone. Everyone was very nice, and I had so many people who were stopping to make sure I was okay, and people were offering food, water, like just everyone was very helpful. And I met so many interesting people along the way, and I got to hear their stories, and just the connections I had were really one of my favorite parts of this whole trip.
So one of the nice parts of going on a bike trip is meeting other people doing their bike trip and spending a day or two getting to know them and riding. On your trip, were there certain places that were good for meeting other people doing a bike tour, or was it all pretty sparsely inhabited?
I didn't meet any other cyclists until I got to the Rockies, and I thought that being way up in northern Canada, I wasn't going to bump into too many people or other cyclists. But every day I was meeting people who were doing the trip from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, going down to Argentina. I would bump into those guys once or twice a day. So I ran into quite a few cyclists along the way in the second half of my journey. And even on the Dempster Highway, I got there later in the season. I bumped into a few people along that route.
You have a post on Instagram talking about the simplicity of a journey lies in focusing on the essentials and letting go of complexities. How does that manifest itself for you on one of these trips?
Well, I find that bike touring, you really, being that you're on a bicycle, you only take what you need to survive. You're taking one thing at a time. And, you wake up, you get your day started, and you're just riding. And if a problem comes up, you deal with it. And so I feel like everything is just kind of like step by step process. You just take things one step at a time.
The one thing I notice, and when you're speaking, is in life, we always have multiple issues. We've got 6 emails we've got to work on. We've got somebody to phone back. We've got stuff to do. And when you're on one of these big trips, it's just like, I've just got to ride my bike to like the shop and buy some food. Like that's the only thing I got to do.
Yeah.
And until I get that food, there's nothing else for me to really do. And then once you get the food, it's like, okay, I got to go find a place to put up my tent. And I never actually thought about kind of the sequential aspect of you're just doing one thing at a time as opposed to regular life where we multitask again and again and again.
Yeah, you're just focusing on what you have to do to survive and what you have to do if a problem comes up. It's just very one step at a time.
And you had, I think another post that said something around the journey unfolded differently than what you expected. Can you talk about how you deal with change on a trip like this?
You just gotta roll with the punches. You can never fully expect what a journey is going to look like. You don't know what's going to come up, what's going to happen, or who you're going to meet along the way. And so I just was really going with the flow. I know that on this trip, I got sick very often. And because of this, I was getting to the Arctic pretty late in the season. And even though that was something I was nervous about, I knew, okay, I'm just going to make sure that I dress warm enough. And, if the weather gets really bad, I'll hide for a day or two, but I'm still going to just go with it.
And that feeling of going for a swim in the Arctic at the end, sometimes that last day, that last moment's a bit of a letdown. For you, how did it feel to jump in that icy cold water?
Oh, that day was interesting. And I just want to say before then that the day I was getting to the Arctic Ocean, I really didn't know how to process that at all. Because I had thought about this trip for 4 years, and all of a sudden I was having these moments of, I'm about to jump in the ocean and I don't know how to feel about this. So when I got there, I felt a little numbed out. I didn't really know what to think. But when I took that plunge into the ocean, it was the most refreshing plunge I'd ever taken in my life. It felt so good. And it was definitely cold. It was 10 degrees, windy, no sun. And I did think at first, all right, do I really want to do this? But yeah, I really want to. And I ended up going in twice just because
wow.
of how nice it felt.
I was telling my wife about how you do your art on the road, and my wife's an artist as well, and she just said, how do you do it? And she was interested, like, what's in your art kit? Because, she tries to take something super minimal and then she doesn't have anything. And, we're ultralight travelers, so she can't take anything serious. And so for people that are looking to take, an art kit on their trip, what are some of the key aspects that make it work and make it not too heavy?
Well, that's the whole thing when you bring an art kit is you're going to pack a little bit heavier. And I'm also a photographer as well, so I'm adding on even more weight. But so what I take with me for art supplies is I have a small watercolor kit. I have a pad of paper with me that's not too big, a couple brushes, and one of those compact camping mugs so I could put water in and dip my paintbrushes in that. So it's not super big. Everything fits in a laptop bag. But of course it will add on a little bit more weight, but it's not too bad. It's really my cameras that take up more space, and yeah, but it's important to get the reference shots too along the way for future works.
Yeah, I think back to when I used to carry an SLR with, an extra lens. And now I think my camera bag that I used to carry 20 years ago probably weighs more than my backpack that I take out now. And I just think back, I'm like, oh, was that ever painful? And I know I lose quality with my iPhone shots, but it's incredible, like thinking back to all the stuff I used to take for a camera. But then I'm just an amateur, and I just put photos in a scrapbook, so I'm not looking to do anything special. Thinking back to your trip, I'm always interested in, I feel like we all get this image ingrained of a trip that's kind of like the core memory. Do you have that for this trip? Is there something when you think of your whole trip, there's one memory that comes back and kind of defines the trip for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think there's one specific memory that comes back, and especially since it's only been 3 weeks that I ended my journey, I'm just getting a lot of flashbacks right now of different parts of the trip. Maybe down the road there will be a specific memory, but at the moment right now, I'm just kind of processing everything.
Yeah, it's funny. When in the moment we remember everything, and then 20 years later, you just remember kind of the weird stuff or the great stuff. And I was just talking with somebody today about a hut on the Tour de Mont Blanc. It's one of my best memories from 25 years ago, and it's only because the room had like a bunk bed with 3 levels, and just 4 people would sleep in each level, but you didn't know the person you're sleeping with. And it's like, if you ask me anything else about that trip, I have vague memories, but I can like almost see the people. And that was, back from the 90s. It's funny how the memories that stick. Hey, Celt, thanks for coming on the show today. It was really interesting to hear about your trip, as well as, getting some tips for how to do art when you're on one of these big trips. Because I think that's something that for a lot of people, they stop doing, and it's something they really miss.
Well, thank you for having me, and it was my pleasure to share all of that with you.
If people want to check out, some of your posts from your trip or else see your art, where can they find you?
So for my posts with my trip and my artwork, that would be on my Instagram. But if people just want to check out my artwork, they can go and find me on my website.
Excellent. So I'll put links to Celt's Instagram and her website in the show notes. And with that, thanks for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.